but I have some theories. I'm really proud of how my boyfriend handled everything. He's a calm, collected person, but I always assumed he wouldn't be that way in a crisis. I just hope I never see this person again, ever.
Number 3.
This started about a month ago on weekends. To help better explain the story, I'll explain my house. The house is actually rather large, 2-story house, or was. It was split into 3 separate apartments well before I ever moved in. There are 2 down on the first floor and 1 upstairs. The apartment next door is occupied by one of my best friends, and the upstairs apartment is very recently empty. I've lived here for 6 years with a roommate, our 3 cats, and my dog. Her and I have never had any issues prior to this, but very recently our dog started barking randomly at nothing during the night, or so we thought. He would look out the window very intently, then run to the front door barking the whole way. We actually thought he was just seeing a cat or a rabbit and brushed it off, just telling him to hush. One night, my friend or neighbor came knocking and said he thought he had seen someone out on his porch. He said he had grabbed a cane and tried to follow them, but they jumped over the porch and ran off. Since then, we made sure to check every time my dog seemingly barked at nothing during the night, and my neighbor had seen a figure suddenly bolt at least twice upon checking. We've called the cops, but they said that there wasn't much they could do. They asked if there was anyone we could think of who may be messing with us, and while there were some neighbors we had occasionally had to call the landlord on, there was no one we could think of. The issues we'd had never been more serious than them being a little loud at 3 a.m. on a drunken Friday night. So we continued to live our normal lives. My roommate works 3rd shift while I and my neighbor work 2nd shift, although he had just recently switched to this shift from 3rds himself. Nothing ever happened while I was home alone, and I figured it was over. Recently, however, I got a girlfriend, and due to scheduling, I will usually spend the night at her house in the middle of the week, as those are often when my days off occur. Meaning, at night, there is no one home except for my dog, as my roommate only has weekends off. Last week, I was at my girlfriend's and things were going well. We'd had a bit of a fight, so I was lying in bed, mulling things over in my head, unable to sleep. As I'm laying there, around 2 a.m, my phone buzzes. I check it and see a text from my roommate asking me to call her when I get the text. I figured she was on break at work and just bored, or wants to shoot the shit about Overwatch since it had just come out, and I hadn't got to play it yet, not having been home. I give her a call and she says she's at home and thinks somebody's been in the house. I ask what makes her think that, and she says that our friend or neighbor had gotten home late from his job around 1:30. He said he'd been home watching random stuff on YouTube, laughing rather loudly since he thought he was literally the only person in the house. He said he thought he had heard someone walking around, and at first thought it was me, until he remembered I was at my girlfriend's. He wondered why my dog didn't bark until he realized I'd taken my dog with me since her kids wanted to meet him. He called my roommate to ask if she'd called off work, when he said he started hearing a scratchy meow outside his window. He walked outside to find our eldest cat outside, meowing to be allowed back into the house. Our cats never go outside normally, but had once before, so he scooped him up and went over to the apartment. The door that separates our apartment is normally unlocked since he comes over a lot, and put him down. He tells my roommate this, and she said she then told her boss, who told her to come home. My roommate came home and said she found our front door unlocked, which she never leaves unlocked, and the door to our sunroom was shut. We never shut that door since our cat's litter boxes are in there, and they wouldn't be able to get into them if we did. She's checking around and finds boxes moved out of our hall closet, and a bunch of my card game and board game boxes scattered around, not how we had left them. She then said that she heard a meow and found one of our cats shut in the bedroom. Every day before she leaves, she makes sure no cats are in there, since one has a bad habit of pissing on the bed if shut in there. Also, our bass guitar was knocked off of its guitar stand and onto the floor. None of the cats weigh enough to knock over that thing, especially not our kitten who was shut in there. So she gets freaked out and checks the windows. One in the sunroom is open so the cats can sit in it and get some air, but the screen is untouched. She said that she went outside and found a trash can dragged up against the house under that window, as if someone had stood on it to peep in. So the best we can figure is that whoever this person is, they were sneaking around again, and when they didn't hear our dog, they broke in. They must have been in the middle of looking through our stuff when they heard my neighbor laughing, panicked, and ran off. I'm not taking any of this lightly, and will be acquiring a gun since I'm often here alone at night.
Number 2.
So, before I explain the story, I just want to set a few things straight. I had this friend who was a twin. They had a younger sister too, but that is irrelevant. Shortly after the twins were born, the mum had a stillbirth, and it caused her a massive amount of stress. My friend would tell me that he remembers when he was younger, he would wake up to his mum in the other room talking to the empty crib. She would have conversations at strange hours of the night, but apparently this kind of behavior is pretty normal given the circumstances. It messed her up pretty bad, and later on she started telling everyone she was a medium type thing. She claimed she had a sixth sense and was sensitive to afterlife phenomena. The older the twins got, she started to calm down a bit with the strange behavior, but she still believed she had a gift. So, now that I've gotten that out of the way, I can tell you the creepy experience that happened to me when I was at their house during a boys' night. It was the twins' birthday, and the one I was friends with managed to convince his mum to invite a small handful of friends over. His mum made plans to go out that night with her new partner, which was great because we always got up to no good, and without supervision, this was the perfect opportunity to get up to some mischief. His mum finally left us alone. After an hour or so, we were running out of things to do. I don't know why, but I suggested we try a Ouija board. I've seen it in movies and thought it would be hilarious if we tried it out ourselves. All the boys agreed and I got to work setting up the table outside. I cut out letters with a yes and no. I placed them in a circle on a plastic table and put one of his mum's shot glasses in the middle. I explained the rules to the guys and we were all extremely excited to give it a go. The other twin was tired though. He said he was going to have a shower and call it an early night. He also didn't like the idea of us doing this sort of thing, but we continued to do so anyways, despite his concern. We decided that we would set up a tripod camera to overlook the table just in case anything supernatural were to happen. We turned it on and started to record. At this point, we were all sitting around the table. We placed our fingers on the shot glass and started firing questions into the circle. We were asking stupid, immature questions like, "Are you gay?" or "Can we speak to Elvis?" etc. Nothing seemed to happen, but we were all laughing and carrying on. Then the glass started to move, but we could tell straight away it was someone on the table. You could tell by the way the glass was moving. It was obvious and annoying because I really wanted it to work. We started to get restless and were on the verge of giving up on the whole thing because people were being stupid and no one was giving it a fair chance. But the next bit is where things get weird. The air became cold and the breeze, it died down. I remember that chilling feeling, shivering outside in the cold. My eyes started to water and I felt hypersensitive. I'm pretty sure the other guys felt it too. And that's when it happened. The glass started moving randomly. It felt completely different this time. It wasn't being pushed, if that makes sense. It was kind of dragging our fingers along the table. The movement was slow and eerie. At this point, we all looked up at each other, darting from face to face, trying to figure out who was messing around this time. Every single face around the circle looked terrified and confused. The glass moved from letter to letter, not spelling words, but only gibberish. I hated the feeling, but I needed to know more. I started to ask serious questions this time. Who are you? Still, nothing. The glass was just moving around with no purpose. Then it would stop as if it disconnected. Then it would start up again. It would get weak, then fade back in with the movement. Are you a person? I asked. The glass moved to the center, then back down to no. This is the moment where I knew that this was a bad idea. The glass started to pick up speed. It was moving around in circles, completely ignoring the letters. Its movements became fast and aggressive. It felt as if it was being pushed into the table really hard. Everyone was horrified. A few guys even took their fingers off of the shot glass in shock. The remainder of us decided to push on out of curiosity. Are you dead? Another person asked. The glass slowly slid over to yes. Then, all of a sudden, the lights and all of the power to the house turned off. We were all sitting in pitch black darkness with sudden silence. We shot up and broke away from the table. There was a sense of panic in the air, and we all started to completely freak out. But then the power, it surged back on, and the TV, it started up again. The other twin ran outside, still wet from the shower, only wearing a towel. He came out asking who turned the bathroom lights off while he was in there. We explained the situation outside with the Ouija board, and he refused to believe it. Then I thought, yes, we recorded it with the camera. We ran over to the tripod and grabbed the camera to show him the evidence. But the camera, it was turned off, and we were all dumbfounded because it had full battery when we started, and we were positive we pressed record. We quickly turned it back on, and yes, the battery was just about full, like I thought. We pressed play, but me being the amateur that I am, I had recorded it on an awkward angle. You couldn't see the table, just the back of our heads. As it played out, we got to the part just before the power to the house turned off, and then so did the camera footage. The video just stopped. Somehow, the camera turned off at the exact same time the house power went out. The weird thing was, the camera was on a battery and had nothing to do with the house power. The mood of the night was ruined, and no one was happy or excited. We were all just quiet. Everyone was trying to process what had just happened. Even the twin who was in the shower was confused and creeped out. We asked him if he was the one who messed around with the power inside, and he swore he hadn't. I believe him to this day. I never messed around with a Ouija board after that chilling experience. What started off as a joke became weird really fast. I just want to know if anyone else has had a similar story. This happened years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My eyes are watering as I'm trying to tell you this. Now that I'm older, I'm thinking about trying it one last time this weekend with a good friend. I'm actually hoping for a similar reaction now that I'm more mature. I'm sure I can hold it together this time and understand it a bit better. I don't know what to think, but yeah, that's my story. Thanks for listening.
Number 1.
I am and always have been a very small girl, standing at 4'11", full grown now at 27, and I've always been able to pass as being much younger than I am, especially if I'm not wearing makeup. When I was a small child of about 7 or 8, my father bought a little cabin in a town in Texas called Livingston, in an area of Livingston called Onalaska. I specify because of the second part of the story. Anyone with kids needs to be wary of the area. The cabin was really nothing remarkable at only 600 square feet. It was really just one giant room, a teeny kitchen with the size of a normal bathroom, and a bathroom the size of a large closet, and a porch out front. The whole property consisted of 2 lots, so there was plenty of space, but the cabin itself was dinky. The whole area was in a strange mix between backwoods and suburbia. It was a true neighborhood, but not in the prim and neatly kept neighborhoods I was used to in suburbia Houston. Despite this, it became a very fun place for me, and some of my greatest memories in life are at that cabin, including my evacuation story from Houston during Hurricane Rita, but that is a story for another day. Anyways, around 11 to 12 years old, my father bought me a 4-wheeler, and the little lake town suddenly became a lot bigger. I didn't go super far, but I definitely ended up going further than I had ever gone before, and it was quite common to see me zipping up and down the roads with a pile of neighborhood kids on the back of the 4-wheeler when we would go up to the lake house on weekend visits. This was around 2001 to 2002, so cell phones were a thing, but it was still common for people not to have them. Usually I had a beeper that I carried around, but with no phones at the lake house, my father gave me a walkie-talkie with a very long reach instead. Looking back on it now, from a world of cell phones, this seems like a bad idea. But this was a small town and we spent so much time here that it felt safe. So one of these weekends, I was buzzing around my neighborhood like I usually did, and I stopped at this peninsula that overlooked the lake. This was a set of docks that us kids always came to when we wanted to swim, despite the very real threat of giant alligators. But being stupid kids, we really don't worry about that. And I was overlooking the lake when my walkie-talkie buzzed to life. Naturally thinking it was my parents trying to reach me, I answered quickly. I couldn't quite make out what they said at first, so I tried confirming that it was my dad. This point in the neighborhood was a little ways away from the cabin, but I had reached my parents from this point before, so despite the fact I could not quite recognize the voice, I assumed that it was my dad. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but it was off enough that I remember being slightly annoyed. Garbled questions that I answered, but no answers that would have hinted who I was or where I was. Eventually the conversation started to drift in a way that I knew something was off, but I was not alarmed just yet, as my dad was notorious for pulling pranks on me and goofing around. I kept talking, stupidly. Alarm bells weren't going off yet. Finally though, the guy on the other end of the walkie-talkie made a comment. I cannot for the life of me remember exactly what he said, but it was enough to make me doubt that it was my father. This is when things took an extremely creepy turn. Bear in mind, I had been talking to this guy pretending to be my father for a good 15 minutes, sitting on my 4-wheeler on this peninsula.
I can see you. You should come take a ride on my boat,
he said. My father had a boat, but this was so out of character that it made me realize it wasn't my father. Dad? You're not Dad, are you?
What are you talking about?
He said. If you can see me, I started, feeling a bit peeved that this guy had been messing with me. What am I wearing? He paused for a second before the walkie-talkie crackled to life, and he said very clearly,
You're wearing an orange shirt. You have red hair and you're sitting on a 4-wheeler right by the swim docks. Why don't you come ride in my boat?
At this point, my eyes widened and my blood ran cold. This entire time, some strange guy that I don't know had been watching me from God knows where. It took me about 10 seconds to look around wildly and then kick the 4-wheeler up and race out of there so fast that the wheels had a hard time catching the ground. I remember the wheel spun out against the gravel beneath me, and when the 4-wheeler finally started moving, little me had a hard time holding on. I floored it the entire way home, stopped in the middle of the yard, and burst into the house. Obviously, the first thing I did was ask my parents if they had contacted me, which they had not. and hadn't for hours. I was in such a panic that there was just no way my dad wouldn't have confessed that it had been him. He was a practical joker, but he knew the fun was over. I hate to think what might have happened had I continued sticking around the area, or if I hadn't have figured out that it wasn't my dad pulling my leg. Nothing came of this incident though, and my childhood up there resumed as normal. Eventually, the weekend visits stopped, but the story doesn't end there. During my parents' divorce, I moved to live at the lake house permanently with my father, or at least until we could find something better. This was the only place we could go when he left my mother, which is a long story in and of itself, but I won't get into that. My father had recently suffered from health issues, so I took a job at a nearby gas station, tobacco barn, to pay the bills and let him recuperate. Thankfully, the lake house had no bills, save for electricity, water, and the internet, so my small salary was enough to keep us going. I only worked there for 3 months, but those 3 months were by far the creepiest I've ever experienced. Within the first month, a rather tall and obese man became infatuated with me, and he couldn't have been creepier. He had a short crew-cut hair and a slightly unkempt beard and moustache combo. The first time we ran into each other, he stared at me with these wide, crazy eyes and ordered his gas, and just stood there for 2 to 3 solid minutes, just staring. When I asked if I could help him, he said nothing. Now, the part of the tobacco farm I worked in was strictly the gas side, and I was pretty much in a glass box with an opening to take people's money and give them their cigarettes, which I could not have been more thankful for. Several times that this man came to visit, he would leave to pump his gas after staring at me awkwardly. About the 4th or 5th time, after I thought he had left, I hear a knock on the other side of the barn on the glass. There he was, face pressed against the glass, staring at me with this wide, manic grin and waving at me with just his fingers. It was enough to send me running for my manager when he left, demanding to go on break before I peed myself. The last time I saw him, I will never forget though. It has been etched into my mind so deeply that I doubt bleach could scrub it away. He arrives as he usually did and orders his gas. This time, however, he reached through the hole in the glass and grabbed my hand before I could put the cash away in the cash register. It wasn't a violent grab, but it was firm enough to keep me from pulling away. Being a very sheltered 18-year-old, I froze in place.
"I love you,"
he said, refusing to let go of my hand. I simply stared at him, unnerved, and alarm bells ringing in my head.
"Say it.
"What?" I responded.
Say you love me."
Naturally, I just wanted this guy to go away, and being so freaking scared out of my mind at this point of him, I stammered and said it out of impulse. Maybe he would let me go and go away. "I love you," I said uneasily.
"Call me if you need anything. What's my number?"
He asked again. This threw me off completely, and the look on my face probably gave away my confusion, because he repeated himself, despite my stammering that I did not know. Finally, he said something that made my blood run cold. I felt like I was going to throw up.
"It's 911.
He winked. This guy was the sheriff deputy, the person I'd have to call if I got into some sort of trouble in town. The person I'd have to call if I had a medical emergency, or if someone tried to rob me. And he wouldn't let go of my hand. I just nodded, trying to keep myself from shaking bad enough for him to feel it. He had never pulled up in a police car or anything, but when I talked to my manager, she confirmed what he said as being true. Once he did let go of me and went on his way, I retreated to the back and demanded to be relieved from the gas station area. I didn't care. I just did not want to see that guy ever again. Thankfully, we moved soon after, so I never had to. But I will never forget the leering grin that man gave me every single time he purchased gasoline. You'd think moving away would be the end of the story, but no. It got even worse when I went to college. And you wouldn't think that that would be the case, considering I was in Galveston. I needed to go to my counselor to discuss a few things, and this usually involved about 30 minutes of chit-chat, as my counselor and I had become close while I was attending school. During one of these chats, which my father had attended due to him attending school and the same classes as I in an effort to finally get his degree, I mentioned Onalaska, Texas, and how we had owned a lake house up there. Instantly, a happy expression left my counselor's face. She informed me that she had been a social worker in that area for quite a few years, and suddenly, my childhood playground took an extremely dark turn, and the sheriff at the gas station became a nightmare. Apparently, the area was notorious for pedophilia, kidnappings, and other horrible incidents. Whole neighborhoods, including police officers, were in on it, and it was common for people trying to out the incidents to either go missing or be completely thrown out of the community through intimidation tactics. She proceeded to tell me of several cases she had worked on, careful to leave out confidential details, of course, including incidents of entire families being in on the whole mess. When I told her about the sheriff I had encountered, she kind of paled and wouldn't tell me any more, except that she wasn't surprised. The conversation went on for over an hour and a half, but it was enough to make me never want to return to the small town I had called my childhood summer home, and vow to never, ever bring any children I might have in the future there.
Number 5.
I live in a small town built in bushland where a lot of elderly people reside. So it's safe to say that it's always been a safe neighborhood, and I've never needed to be overly cautious. This is probably why I had often been naive enough to believe that although there is a small possibility of something bad happening to me, I thought it was far too unlikely. At the time, I was 15 years old, and I used to go out on weekends to visit my boyfriend at the time, who lived quite a while away from me. I wasn't able to drive at this age, so public transport was my only means of going over to visit him. This meant walking about 20 minutes from my house to a bus stop, catching the bus into the city, and then catching a train to his house. I used to do the same trip every week, and I felt safe taking the trip by myself. As I was only able to see him once during the week, I would leave early in the morning and get there and stay until fairly late before going home. Because it was late by the time I left my boyfriend's house, and public transport was less frequent at that hour, it would be a waste of time for my boyfriend to travel any of the way back home with me. So every week, I made the trip back home alone. On one particular night, after visiting my boyfriend, it was a usual ride on the train back into the city, and I was waiting at the bus station. The bus station is a large, open building above a number of platforms on a lower story where the buses would pull in. I was waiting on the upper story on a bench in front of the stairs that led to the platform I needed for my bus home. I don't recall there being many people around, maybe 1 or 2 people passing by, but it was essentially deserted because of the late hour. Also, on a side note, because I was visiting my boyfriend, I dressed up to look pretty for him. I was wearing a decent casual dress. I had straightened my long hair so it looked neat, and I had just recently received some high platform boots for my birthday, which I thought looked super cool, and they were fun to wear because I didn't feel so short. I was ruffling through my bag for some gum, and I noticed someone sit down on the bench next to me. Usually, when someone sits on a bench which is already occupied, they leave a sort of one-person gap between. But this person sat down right beside me, despite there being a whole bench available. When I looked up from my bag, I saw a man who was maybe 30 years old. I'm a terrible judge of age, so I'm not really sure. I don't remember too much about his appearance. I think he was bald or had short hair. Being naive, I didn't think to try to remember any details about his appearance, which I would have done had this happened to me now. When our eyes met, he asked me something along the lines of, "Have you got any weed?" At 15, I was a good kid and didn't have anything to do with smoking or alcohol, and certainly not hard drugs. I told him no and continued to sit uncomfortable on the bench waiting for the bus. Then he gestured up towards the bus schedule above the stairs to the platform and asked me,
Where are you heading?
as if him asking me about the drugs wasn't warning sign enough for me to not tell him where I was going. I obediently told him that I was catching the 123 bus to XYZ. Coincidentally, he responded with,
Oh, me too.
I found this a bit unlikely since it was a small town where the bus was headed, but it was still possible that he was actually headed this way. I started to get suspicious at this point, and I was already feeling very uncomfortable. I looked down at my phone in hopes that he wouldn't talk to me anymore. He noticed this and asked me what phone service I was with. I told him the service, and he said,
I've got a voucher for phone credit for that service, but I can't use it because I'm with a different service. Did you want it?
I politely declined, assuming he had ill intentions, but unsure what benefit he would gain from giving me this voucher. In hindsight, maybe he was trying to get my phone number or something. I honestly don't know. He persisted.
Are you sure? Why not? I can't use it.
But I declined again. No thank you. Things got weirder after that, when he pointed out my big platform shoes and asked,
Is it difficult to run in those shoes?
Creepy. I lied and said, No, I can run very well in these. He then gestured to the stairs down to the bus platform and suggested that we both go down there to wait for the bus. The platform is very poorly lit and there was probably no one down there. I did not want to be there alone with this person, so I told him that I was going to wait here, but that he could wait down there if he wanted to. As expected though, he didn't move and remained on the bench with me. A few moments later, I noticed someone walking towards us through the bus station. Against all possible odds, it happened to be someone that I recognized. It was my friend's older brother. He was probably about 17 at the time. Ben! I almost shouted when I saw him. He made his way over and stood in front of me on the bench. I asked him which bus he was catching, and luckily it was the same one as me. I was so relieved. We exchanged a few words back and forth, and eventually the creepy guy sitting next to me got up and wandered off. He hadn't said anything while Ben and I were talking. Ben and I went down to the platform and got on the bus when it arrived. And surprisingly, the creepy guy didn't get on the bus like he said he was going to. I told Ben about what had happened and how he had saved me. I can't imagine what would have unfolded if Ben had not showed up when he did. I would have gone down to the platform when the bus arrived, and hopefully he would have not done anything since there was someone driving the bus. If he had gotten as far as getting on the bus with me, I was worried about the 20-minute walk from my bus stop to my house. We are on a dark street surrounded by bush on one side, and I didn't have credit on my phone to call my mum and ask for a lift.
Number 4.
I used to live in a market town in the United Kingdom, and like every town, we had our town mascot. You know that one person everybody knows about? That crazy lady that does loads of meth, or the creepy drunk that shouts at strangers? Yes, that type of mascot. The guy everyone knew in my place was called Johan, sometimes referred to as Johan the Guitar Man by the locals. He was an average-sized guy with a dark beard and a happy demeanor, and he was very religious, a born-again Christian. He would often be found on the street corners talking in tongues while strumming his guitar. He could also be spotted singing one of his songs while giving his posters, every word of which was in rainbow font, to passerby or waving at school children. That, and he'd have maracas he would shake at random intervals. I guess you could say he was some sort of pseudo-street preacher or something. To most, he was harmless, though there were a lot of stories floating around about Johan, and at school there would be frequent stranger danger warnings about him. One such story was that he was in a car crash and had severe brain damage. Another was that he was initially going to study science at the University of Cambridge, but had a religious experience and gave it all up. But by far, the worst rumour we heard was that he'd raped some young girl, but was so overwhelmed with guilt by the act that he lost his mind and decided to convert. There were also weird things that Johan actually did do. It was his birthday sometime in July, and he was giving out invitations in the street to a party he was going to have. I'm afraid I didn't go myself, though I'm curious if people actually did. His apartment, a place above a shop adorned with the words "Jesus loves you" painted across the outside wall, it was tiny, and he invited a lot of people. The overall local attitude towards Johan was that even though he was nuts, he was more or less harmless. Over the years, I collected numerous amounts of his posters, and he'd pop in occasionally to where I worked and we'd chat. I even got one of his CDs off of him. I probably still have it somewhere. Even teachers I knew would put up his posters in their classrooms. I vividly remember my English teacher displaying rainbow-coloured size 36 words stating, "You are all wonderfully loved," obviously gifted from Johan. Anyway, back to me. I had many experiences with Johan over the years, and most of them were pleasant, generally just saying "Hi Johan" as I passed on my way to work and school and whatnot. To be honest, I did get funny vibes off of him, but I decided to ignore them. He actually lived on the same street as me, so we were neighbours and I was eventually used to his constant appearances. One particular day, however, he greeted me by my name. I had never told him my name though.
Good morning, my dear sister Emma.
I wasn't all surprised by this. He knew the names of a few of my friends, so perhaps they told him my name at some point. I greeted him in return and told him I was doing fine. I didn't want to talk for too long as I had to get to my friend's house, so I tried to keep it short. We talked about something menial, probably the weather. I made my excuse to leave and he ended the conversation with,
"May Jesus shower his ever-flowing love on you. Would you like me to bless you today, Sister Emma?"
I thought this was sweet, so I hesitantly agreed. And hey, it would be a funny story to tell my friend, right? Plus, this probably wouldn't take too long anyway. Johan proceeded to put down his guitar and then roughly grabbed me by my hand, chanting hoarsely in tongues. It hurt. He had scraped my wrist in the process, and it was then I noticed he had grossly long nails. It would be an understatement to say I was a little freaked. The chanting got more intense, and then he suddenly reverted to English.
"May the love of heaven flow over Emma, her descendants, and all those that care for her. May she find a loving husband to provide for her. May her demons be driven from her soul. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. Bless her. Bless her. Bless her."
During all the "Jesus loves you" and "bless her" parts, he was leaping up and down enthusiastically while holding my hand tightly, scratching me further. He was excited, laughing manically. He then ended the blessing, if you could call it that, with some vicious, high-pitched mouth trumpeting, like he was impersonating a kazoo or something. If it wasn't totally terrifying, I would have laughed. He eventually let go of my hand. I shakily thanked him and walked away as quickly as possible. Of course, after all of that, I made my way to my friend's place and we laughed about it. Although I showed her my hand or wrist and she was just as freaked out as I was. But I didn't rule it as intentional harm, and we both forgot about it and did whatever we were going to do that day. Eventually, I left town and went to university, forgetting all about Johan. But then, through a pal on Facebook, a link to the local news was posted. Johan had been arrested and was to face trials for stalking and sending threatening messages to a girl around my age. It appeared that he was angry at the girl for not responding to his advances after he wanted to be more than just friends with her, and the messages became creepily sexual, asking the girl if she wanted a taste of his chocolate cake. He believed that the girl was his wife and believed that their love was a sign from God, and they were apparently destined to be together. He eventually ended up threatening to kill the girl, her boyfriend, and their families for crimes of adultery. It turns out he was friends with a lot of local gang members, and he was considering sending them to the home of the girl and her boyfriend. The chilling words on one of his final letters to her said,
God unfortunately says that unless you give up your ways, he will have to execute you. You've seen all the thunder and lightning. Take that as a sign. It would take just one lightning bolt to finish you off, my lovely.
What makes it even worse is that the girl used to go to my school, and although it wasn't at the same time as me, I used to work at the same place as her. In that regard, I questioned the motive behind all of the friendly chats Johan would have with me, and whether he did mean harm behind all the oddly rough hand grabbing. For the most part though, I believe that he was a man that needed help, but he was largely ignored due to being harmless. It's a shame myself and my old hometown, including that poor girl, had to find out the hard way. He eventually got detained under the Mental Health Act, and I have to say that I'm relieved for him.
Number 3.
I'll try to keep this as brief and detailed as possible. However, my story becomes quite hard to explain without giving any context. I'm a 17-year-old boy now and have been interested in mountaineering and the wilderness ever since I was a young lad. This story takes place in the summer of 2011 when I was about 11 years old. My family and I, being the adventurous type, decided to climb Mount Rinjani in Indonesia, a huge volcano which is rich in wildlife and forestry. It wasn't strange for my family to go off on these amazing adventures as we were the types who loved exploring. My family consisted of, all told, about 25 people. The beginning of this encounter starts on the third and final day of our descent down the volcano. After about 7 hours of walking, my uncle, 2 of my cousins, and I had finally got to the bottom. I should have mentioned this earlier, but when we hiked, we all went off in our little pods. My uncle and 2 cousins and I at the front, my 2 sisters, aunt, male cousin, and mother, second, etc. These pods were set about 500 meters apart, and although this is a significant distance, we were 100% certain that no one was between our walking pods, as we all set off at the same time and there is only one way down the summit. But this is where it gets creepy. We were waiting at the bottom for the second pod of family to arrive when, after about 10 minutes of waiting patiently, we heard a loud screaming coming from the direction of the path. We then see my cousin, Seb, and my sister Sarah come sprinting down the volcano, fear in their eyes and a shortness of breath to their speech. The following is their recollection of the events that took place, so forgive me if I'm being a little inaccurate. They were walking on the path which was eerily surrounded with tree lines on both sides, when all of a sudden they all simultaneously notice a black bin bag directly hanging in the way of the path, disrupting the walking pattern of the group. Growing up in Myanmar and knowing just about everything there is to know about spirituality, my mother and aunt described it as a bag one might fill with chicken heads when performing witchcraft. This was mainly because of the placement of it, as if to entice a weary traveller to touch it and thus allow the hex to attach itself. They shrugged it off as a bag filled with fecal matter or something of the sort and continued the descent. A few hundred meters on, and my sister Anne says to my mum and aunt, "Can you feel that?" Though no other words were exchanged, they both knew what my sister meant. They later described it as an urging worry that someone or something was watching them. The next thing to take place is still hard for my family to talk about. They said that Seb whispered to them, "Guys, be very quiet and turn around." My sister and mum complied, though my aunt refusing, stating that she feared the worst. What they saw next can only be described as something from mythology. They recalled seeing a pitch-black dog-shaped creature emerge from the bushes a good 20 meters behind them. They described it as being huge, not in height, but in muscle tone, far too big to be a village dog. They said it was jet black with visibly white teeth, but this is the part that still scares me to this day. They said that, despite the distance separating them, it could be seen as having bright yellow eyes. Now, we are the proud owners of a Newfoundland who weighs in at a solid 90 kilos, and for those who haven't seen them before, at times they can be extremely intimidating, so when my mum says that this thing is huge, I take it at face value. They continued to walk with this thing hunting them, to use their phrase, for a good 5 minutes before it seemingly vanished into the shrubs. They took this as their key to sprint for the bottom, which was now in sight. What worried them most, however, wasn't its appearance, but rather what its intentions were, and how long it may have been on the trail for. The final pod of 6 or so made it down the volcano only 5 minutes after the second arrived, stating that they encountered no such creature, and, what is probably more disturbing, no black bin bag. The reason that I find this so mind-boggling is because the first pod, which I was in, saw no black thing, nor any sign of the bin bag in question. Though this might seem meaningless, us being the first ones down the only route to the bottom knew for a fact that no other mountaineers came after us. So for us not to have seen it, it means that it must have been placed after us, and in addition to this, for the final pod not to have seen it, required someone to remove it once pod 2 went past. This means that there was some weirdo up there tying bin bags to vines, and then untying them once again just to fuck with us. There is also no way it could have blown down, as the volcano was practically windless. This brings me to the final question. What was that black dog creature on the mountain? Was it connected to the voodoo bag which was seen on the path? And finally, has anyone else had such an experience with these beasts? For the record, after arriving home, I checked to see if there was any logical explanation for what they saw. There are no recorded wild dogs which inhabit this part of Indonesia. They maintain their story to this day, and even though I'm usually a skeptic, I have no choice but to believe them. I spoke to my cousin Seb about it a couple of weeks ago, and he's a pretty big guy, like 6'2" rugby player, but he said this thing drove fear straight into his heart. He felt like it was pure evil. He felt as though they were being hunted. What chilled me to the bone was when he told me he distinctly remembers whistling before encountering this creature, and, what's even worse, it didn't have a tail. I've been told that these are signs of skinwalkers. Unfortunately, 2 months later, a close family friend who came on the trek was diagnosed with brain cancer. He died last week. My family and I can't help but wonder if that black dog played a part. I know I sound crazy, but with all these things happening and with everything seeming so connected, I don't know what to think anymore.
Number 2.
I graduated high school almost a year ago. I really had no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months. where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before them. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called wwoof.com, Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic was aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, was self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I had been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to really get involved with farming and throw himself into Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences punctuated with and, or and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of the friends I left back home. We became friends fast, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when we spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and, of course, drugs. Every now and then, he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me that he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me that he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure a week more. A couple of days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about wacko David Koresh and the botched siege by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged.
The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up.
I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopath cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject I had just explained to him, and now he's telling me I'm wrong and that Koresh was a martyr? This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After an hour of his absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking loon, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy and much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket, praying I grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it, and I turned around so he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what had happened and that we needed to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm anyway. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine that he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscience. But late one night, I got a text.
Hey, this is Michael. We can get out our car for $280. Want to go traveling?
I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked it up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud banging coming from a barn. I remember thinking that it must have been an animal, but also thinking it must have been a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was just getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walked around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know, it's gross, but I'm the only one who used that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door, and I nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in a corner of my kitchen, facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would only hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo or something. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when I arrived. My guess is that he ran into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained Michael and I's history and what happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon since I believe many of the old hippies thought that they were still avoiding the draft. Honestly though, I didn't mind leaving. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might be out there in the woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up.
Number 1.
This happened over a week ago, and I felt like the first bigger shock and paranoia has settled a little, so I wanted to share what happened with me. I will begin my story with a little explanation about how my apartment building is designed, as that information is quite essential to understanding the story. If it matters as well, I'm a female and 21. So I live in a medium-sized town nearby the center area, but still in a somewhat quiet neighborhood. My building basically has elderly people and families living here, so hence the main doors are always locked, so you either need to have a key or have someone buzz you in order to get inside the building. Once you enter the building, there's obviously the staircase. Well, at each mid-floor, there are these small balconies. I live on the 3rd floor and you can see directly into my bedroom from the balcony, which is located on the 2nd floor. I want to explain one more thing though, before beginning with the juicy stuff. My building is also located behind a big school building, so I usually don't close my curtains as there's nothing but a big empty parking lot in front of it. Now, let's get to the actual experience. It was the night between Wednesday and Thursday, and I didn't have work the next day, so I was just spending some time watching YouTube from my tablet. I hear some noises coming from the hallway, kind of heavy steps and the sound of someone occasionally bumping into the handrail as if drunk or just tired. But that wasn't really anything out of the ordinary, as I do live in a building with other people, so you do hear noises even at night time. The part where it gets weird though is when I heard the footsteps end on my floor. My bedroom wall and the side of my bed where my head is located against a wall where the staircase is on the other side of it, so it was clear that the person had stopped. I don't hear any doors opening, nor any footsteps anymore, just silence. I found it kind of disturbing that someone was just standing in the hallway in the middle of the night. After a while of silence, I heard the footsteps again, but this time much more quiet and gentle, starting to walk back down the stairs. I just thought maybe someone was drunk and entered the wrong staircase or something. Not a big deal, they're gone now. I continued my YouTube marathon for a while before getting kind of sleepy. One thing I really enjoy before going to bed is looking out my window. There's one main road located at the end of the big parking lot, so sometimes I just watch cars passing by before going to sleep. So I put on my music with some quiet volume and began my staring session. During the second song, I suddenly noticed a small source of light and some movement in the down left corner of my eyes. I lowered my gaze and just froze. There was a man on the small balcony staring at me for who knows how long in my bedroom, and I was in just my t-shirt and underwear. After what felt like at least a few minutes of being frozen in shock, I quickly closed the blinds and went to check that both of my apartment doors were properly closed and locked. Luckily, they were. After a while of shivering in my bed, I came to the realization that the man staring at me was most likely the source of the footsteps. He perhaps had heard the sound of someone being awake in my apartment and listened to that for a while. Then maybe noticed the balcony and decided to check it out and noticed that you can see into the windows from there. I'm not completely sure, but I think he could have possibly seen me before I even went to look outside from the window, as I had a small light on in my room and it was relatively dark outside and I had no curtains on. If he didn't see me before though, he for sure as hell did while I was staring out the window. At that point, feeling the discomfort of being creeped on without knowing, my thought process was stopped by the sound of someone trying to open my door. Luckily my door is quite secure, so I didn't think this person could get it open. But then I heard the small letterbox being opened as slowly and quietly as possible. I still feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up while trying to explain this. I have 2 doors, thank God, so he couldn't see directly into my apartment, but I could hear him. He was breathing sort of heavy, constantly swallowing as if he was either very nervous or just somehow disturbed. I think I held my breath and changed into a motionless wax figure until he closed the letterbox and, for some reason, sprinted down the stairs, making a lot of noise again this time. I was so fixated on each sound, so I heard the sound of the hallway door being opened and I assumed that he ran out. I didn't dare look out the window to check as I was still feeling watched. Nothing more happened that night, but I was certainly not getting any sleep after that. I called up my mum and explained what happened. She had work the next day, so I didn't want to disturb her sleep more by asking her to come sleep here or pick me up. So we just agreed that we'd keep the phone line open through Viber throughout the night. I also drank 2 energy drinks. Not such a great idea when your pulse rate is already sky high. I stayed up until it was light outside and normal people were awake. I eventually fell asleep unwillingly. I didn't see the man anymore, at least up until this very moment as I'm sharing this, and I hope to never see him again. But what did happen and has made me even more paranoid is this. The next time I had work after the incident was on a Monday morning. I hadn't really been sleeping well lately and had an early morning. I was already somewhat all over the place, but this just scarred me for life. As I explained before, I have 2 doors in my apartment. Well, I was leaving for work and opened the inner one, and to my surprise, I saw the outer door slightly cracked open. I felt like throwing up and just running into my mum's arms like a little girl just to go somewhere safe, but instead I had to go to work. The rest of the day, I kept looking over my shoulder, constantly having this weird feeling that someone will come to get me, like someone was watching me. I am so thankful for having 2 doors, because he managed to ever so quietly open that outer door. He could have entered the apartment where I was basically passed out and done anything to me. I reported these 2 incidences to the building's management, and together we filed a police report. They promised to have someone guard the premises for a while until the situation settles down. I am still sleeping at my mother's house and hoping that once I return home, I'll be safe and one day be able to get rid of this paranoia. I will not be keeping my curtains open nor checking out the window at night for a while. Ever since I met the creepy truck driver, I watch what I wear in my neighborhood. This happened a few months ago in March of 2016. One day in March, I left my house because I needed to take the bus in order to get to my classes. I'm in college. I didn't like what I was wearing, and I already walked up a big hill in my neighborhood and almost about out of it. I decided to call my boyfriend and ask him to bring a pair of sweatpants because I felt uneasy with my outfit and it gave off a bad feeling. Within 5 minutes of hanging up the phone with my boyfriend, a white truck drives slowly behind me. When I turned around to see who it was, the driver drove slowly next to me. This is how the conversation went with the creep truck driver.
Hello, you look very gorgeous. I just wanted to let you know. Do you need a ride?
Considering I didn't like what I was wearing, this made me feel like a prostitute, but I politely declined, stating that I have a ride.
Are you sure? Because you look cold.
I politely declined again, stating it was alright and I will be fine. After the second try, he gave up. Or so I thought. I immediately called my boyfriend and told him to stay on the phone with me until I at least get on the bus. When I turned the corner to walk down a street to get to the bus stop, I saw garden workers, and in front of the truck was the creepy truck driver parked, waiting for me. When I got close enough to his truck once again, he asked me if he could give me a ride using the same excuse about it being cold outside. I politely declined him for the third time. Once I got on the bus, I hung up the phone with my boyfriend and I called my best friend. As I was explaining what happened, I noticed the creepy truck driver following the bus. He followed the bus for about 15 minutes until the bus broke down and police came on the bus for a different reason. A second bus came, so I did end up making it safe to school. A week after the creepy truck driver tried getting me into his car, my parents went to see a show and my brother was working, so I was home alone with my dog. An hour after my parents left, I heard my dog going crazy, the doorbell ringing non-stop and lots of knocking. I looked out the window and it's the stupid truck driver. He didn't see me though because I peeped through the blinds. By the time I called my neighborhood patrol, he was gone, but they watched my house for a few days. Thinking that was the last straw because now it's May in 2016 and nothing had happened for a few good months. That is, until last week when I was with my best friend walking to Taco Bell. We noticed a red truck driving very slowly. I looked at the driver, and guess who? It's the stupid, creepy truck driver, and he just smiled and waved with his new truck. I don't know how Mr. Creepy Truck Driver knew where I lived, or knew which way I took the bus. This all gives me the chills.
Number 5.
Well, first of all, this all happened when I was in the 9th grade. I had matured early, so I received a lot of gross comments in 7th to 9th grade. This made me lose confidence in myself, so instead of being very sociable and outgoing like I used to be, I was shy and awkward. I had 0 friends, literally 0. So teachers often came up to me and asked if I was lonely and just showed interest in me because I seemed depressed or whatever. My English teacher's name was Mr. Z. He had the creepiest blue eyes, and his smile was even creepier. On the first day of school, he asked us all about ourselves, what our favorite subject was, our names, etc. But he always called on me, even though I never raised my hand. When he asked me, I would speak quietly because everyone stared at me and it made him laugh. He used to call me by my name and then followed with Goodheart. Towards the middle of the year, I noticed that he showed me a lot of favoritism. If he took away our privileges to go to the bathroom, he would say something like,
"Take this to the office,"
and then whisper,
"Go to the restroom if you have to."
When we received our progress reports, I would have A's on assignments I had never done. I never told anyone about that because English was a class I had to pass in order to graduate. As the school year went on, I started to realize that he never looked at me in the eyes. He would stare at my chest, then my legs, at the floor, etc. But when he did look at me, he barely blinked, which made me look away instead. It was very awkward. When I first noticed him blatantly staring at my chest, I didn't think much of it at the time because I'm not very blessed in the chest, so guys usually look at my butt instead. I just figured there was something on my shirt, the first few times anyway. Towards the end of the year, he started asking me to come to his room during lunch so I could help him grade. When I came to his room, we'd have a movie on and we'd watch that for my lunch. He didn't have to teach a class after, so he let me skip my class afterwards. One thing I noticed right away was that there were sex scenes in every movie we watched. He'd ask me if I wanted to skip and I'd shrug because I wanted to act mature. It started to happen every day. We'd watch a movie every day which all had very awkward sex scenes. At the end of the school year, we watched our last movie and this time the scene was very long and very detailed and very awkward. He put his hand on my leg gently and laughed.
"It'll be over soon."
he kept his hand on my leg for the whole thing. Luckily, when the bell rang, I left. I didn't say bye, I just left. The reason why I share this is because I saw him at Petco, my job, a week ago. I didn't think he'd recognize me. I was helping one line of people which had about 5 people in it, and my co-worker was working with a line that had 2. He stood on my line and waited for everyone to finish, even though the other line was empty. When I took his things, avoiding eye contact the whole time, he stared at me. I didn't look up because I didn't want to meet his gaze. Towards the end of the transaction, he started asking me about my life. Did I like my job, how my family was doing, etc. I just gave him short, simple answers while he drilled a hole into my face with his eyes. After we were finished, he smiled and said,
"I'll be back again, good heart."
After freshman year, he was no longer a teacher at my school. I never found out why.
Number 4.
So before I begin, perhaps a bit of background information would help you understand my story. I'm a now 20-year-old male living in the Netherlands, and I've been a geek all my life. Games in particular have always played a major role in my life, starting when I got my first PlayStation when I was 5 years old. Something about gaming just always got to me. Be it mechanically or in terms of storytelling, I could always find something to love about it. As I grew older, I got more and more into RPGs, and eventually found my way onto World of Warcraft. As I got more involved in the game, I started joining raiding guilds. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a group of players who are intent on facing the game's hardest content as a team. The second guild I joined was the greatest bloody team of people I had met thus far. One of these people was a Swedish girl who was around my age, called Maggie. We got along quite nicely, as it turned out her mum, who was also in this guild, was actually living in the Netherlands. So often, we'd end up in conversation where she asked me to teach her some Dutch, and she'd teach me some Swedish in return. It was all good fun. Fast forward to the beginning of 2013. The aforementioned guild had fallen apart a while back, and I had joined a new one. I had stayed in touch with some people in the old guild, but Maggie really hadn't been online all that much. When she did get back online, we quickly caught up. It turned out that she actually moved in with her mother and had spent the last couple of months improving her Dutch and attending a high school. She also started dating this guy called William, who was actually part of this same guild I had met Maggie in. He always struck me as a nice guy. Other guild members always thought that he was a bit direct and perhaps rude. But being Dutch, I understood that's just simply how our culture works, so I was always okay with it. June comes around. Me and Maggie recently finished our final exams and were waiting for the results to come back in. One afternoon, while we were playing online, I suggested a meetup between the two of us. I really didn't have much to do, and given that she had voiced her concerns about finding her footing in Dutch social circles, I figured this was a nice opportunity to take her first baby steps into the country. She excitedly agreed and asked if she could bring William as well. Obviously, I said yes, seeing as he was her boyfriend. Meetups are safer when you arrive as a couple, and meeting former guild members was something I was looking forward to anyway. A couple of days later, I met both of them in Rotterdam and had a great day. I showed them around the city since I knew it best, but had some nice conversations, a few laughs, and we ended the day by taking a trip to Euromast. Before leaving, Maggie had to go to the bathroom, so me and William were waiting outside. Striking conversation, I said to him, "You two make for a nice couple."
"Thanks,"
he replied.
I friggin' love her, you know. Honestly, wouldn't know what I would do without her at this stage."
Back then, I didn't think much of that statement. It's just a thing people say when they are in love, so kudos to him, right? Maggie got out of the restroom, we said our goodbyes, and we parted ways. A few weeks later, we got our exam scores back. I had passed high school with flying colours, but Maggie, she wasn't so lucky. She had failed most of her exams. She told me she was going to be studying for the rest of the summer in order to properly prepare for the rerun of the last year of high school. I told her that if she needed any help that I was willing to see what I could do, even if I was going to college. She was very thankful and assured me that she'd let me know if she needed any help. Fast forward again to September. After our last conversation, Maggie had practically disappeared off of the internet. She hadn't logged into World of Warcraft. She was never on Skype and wasn't even online on Facebook anymore. I had asked William in mid-August how she was doing, and he assured me she was fine, so I thought nothing of it. I even admired her focus on her education. However, during my second week in college, all of that changed. I got into the metro and picked up a free newspaper in the seat next to me to pass the time. I vividly remember turning to the fourth page to read a headline saying, "Swedish woman, 19, from city, stabbed in own backyard." It took me a few seconds to even realize that she lived in that city now, and that she was 19. Even though the article didn't mention a name, I grew very concerned. I quickly sent her a text message as we exchanged phone numbers when we met up, asking her if she was okay. The rest of the day went by, and I heard nothing from Maggie. I eventually figured that if anything had happened to her, people would have most likely started posting things on her Facebook page. Concerned and scared of what I was going to find, I started typing her name into the search bar of Facebook. Sure enough, it was already filling up with messages from people that heard she'd passed away from her injuries. After inquiring with some of the former guild members, it turned out that William, he had stabbed her. She had broken up with him after she got her horrendous test results back, and he wasn't all too pleased with that. In the aftermath of the incident, me and some of the other Dutch guild members went to her city to meet up with her friends from school, attend the memorial set up in her school, and put some flowers at the scene of the crime on behalf of everyone she had played the game with. When we met up with Maggie's school friends, we found out that William, he hadn't been half as nice as we thought he was. During the relationship, he had been very controlling of Maggie, and after the breakup, he began stalking her and sending her threatening text messages. She even went to the police to report it, but they told her that they couldn't do anything for her at that stage. After that, she met a different guy and started dating him. William found out and, well, took matters into his own hands. Thinking back on this, the worst part of all of this just came to mind. When we put the flowers at the scene of the crime, we stood around for a few minutes, contemplating whether or not we should knock on the door and personally give her mother our condolences, given that we kind of knew her as well. We decided against it, given that we might unintentionally remind her mother that Maggie's online connections ultimately cost her her life. As soon as we got back to our car, we saw Maggie's front door open. Out of the door came her mother with Maggie's younger sister. I knew at the time that Maggie had a younger sister, but I did not know that she was only 6 or 7. I fucking lost it when I saw her little head hanging down while grabbing hold of her mother, scared to go around the corner to face all the drawings and flowers people had left there. In sharing this story, I found a very recent article that said William is most likely going to prison for 20 years. Honestly, William, I fucking hope you never make it out of there.
Number 3.
So, this happened a while back when I was in my early 20s. I was working at a little retail store in my town's mall. It was coming up to the end of half of the day, and I don't know how I noticed, but an older man, probably 50s, I'm not sure, had walked past my store about 3 or 4 times. Not consecutively, just every now and again. Now, I worked in one of those little costume jewelry stores, so it was odd for an older male to be walking past so many times, but I kind of didn't think anything of it. I don't even know how I picked up on it in the first place. It came to closing time, and I had left to catch my bus home at about 6:30 p.m. I remember it was transitioning into winter because it was dark out by then. I'm a very paranoid person. I still live by the stranger danger rules. So, even now when I leave work, I make sure I change into an outfit less fashionable. I don't like drawing attention to myself in any way possible, so I try to make sure I'm as covered up and average looking as I can be. I don't know why, but I have this disease where I attract all the wrong attention for no reason at all. So, as I said, I was waiting for my bus home. I was sitting by myself at the town centre's bus terminal, and guess who walks past? The older man. At this point, I kind of felt a little uneasy, but in my head I tried to make reason prevail, as many people take buses all the damn time. My bus showed up and I got on, and well, you can all probably guess who got on after me. I remember sitting in the seats facing inward, the ones for wheelchairs and prams, and he sat at the first seat above the steps. I remember staring forward and feeling his eyes burning into me. I kept trying to use my peripheral vision to see if he was looking at me, but not wanting him to know I noticed him. The whole bus ride, I waited to see if he got off before my stop, thinking it was just my over-anxious paranoid mind working overtime, until I pressed the button for my stop. I waited until the last possible second to press it, and as I stood up, he did too. I went to walk to the front door of the bus, and he exited the rear. At that moment, as soon as he stepped off, I sat back down again. I had no idea where the bus went after my stop, but honestly, I didn't fucking care. I will never forget the look on his face as the bus drove off. I have never seen such hate and anger in someone's face than I did through that window. His face is burnt into my memory like a photograph. It still absolutely terrifies me to this day. I have no idea what would have happened to me if I got off the bus at my stop that night, but I'm glad my paranoia was so intense I didn't.
Number 2.
My boyfriend Dan and I had just started renting an apartment together, and money was tight. It was 2001. We were both in our early 20s. I couldn't find a job and relied on word of mouth to earn some cash wherever I could. I love to clean and organize, so I gave friends and family the go-ahead to give out my name and number to anyone who could use my help over the summer. Dan, his brother, and dad all did carpentry work and also got work through word of mouth. None of them had too many exciting stories to tell, other than doing work in a hoarder's house or odd requests as far as cabinet design or placement. Dan got a call from an elderly woman wondering if he could come by and give her an estimate on finishing her kitchen. She said her husband died before he could install the cabinets and countertop that he purchased, and someone from her church gave her his number. He said absolutely and offered to come out the next day. She objected and said, "This needs to be done now. That's why I called. They said that you could help me. What am I supposed to do? I'm an old woman. I live alone. My husband died." Dan was a pretty chill guy and kept calm, explaining that I had his car and I wouldn't be home from running errands for a couple of hours, and by then it would be too dark for him to come out. Let me also note that although Dan had a soft, not very masculine voice, he was a big guy, about 6'4" and muscular. The old lady perked up and asked, "Will she be coming along tomorrow?" in the sweetest voice. Dan said, looking back, this should have been a red flag by the tone in her voice and the fact that she was so adamant about him coming right that moment. But as soon as she heard he had a girlfriend, she changed her tune and got excitement in her voice, asking about the next day like it was no problem for her to wait. He didn't see anything weird about it at the time and felt bad for her because he thought she must have been lonely and wanting company to talk to. The next day, we both head out to her house. We brought along a small bouquet of flowers that we got at the grocery store to give her. I figured she would enjoy chatting while Dan checked out her kitchen, and maybe I could come back with Dan and help her with other things around the house while he worked if she needed. Her township was about 45 minutes away, but I was excited to go because this township is known to have really awesome old houses and mansions. There are other normal subdivisions depending on what direction you drive in. My friends and I back in high school used to drive there just to cruise around and look at neat houses. When we pulled up to the old lady's house, I was eager to go inside because it was such a cute looking house from the outside, very fairy tale-ish, grey with white trim, with vines climbing up the side of the house. It was a shotgun style house, so it looked tiny from the front. The small lawn was overgrown and messy, but I thought it added to the charm of the home. We knock on the door and are greeted by a tiny elderly woman, shorter than me, and I'm 5 foot. She had on a dirty nightgown and even dirtier slippers. She looked past me and smiled widely at me while reaching her bony hands out to grab my face. I hold up the flowers to deflect and say, "Dan wanted to bring you some flowers." She lost her smile, grabbed the flowers and said, "Kitchen's through here." She turned around to lead us, revealing a brown stain on the back of her nightgown. Dan and I look at each other, and he makes a goofy grossed out face. I make a judgmental face back and swat his arm as if to say, "Be nice, she's an old woman." We walk through a dark living room, nothing really out of the ordinary other than the smell, which was like cigarettes, mold and body odor. We enter the kitchen and there's a closed door about 10 feet ahead leading to rooms further back into the house. There's a man sitting shirtless at the kitchen table in the corner. He was hairy and overweight with greasy hair down to his shoulders. The old lady said, "This is my son, Marcus." He was probably in his late 30s, early 40s. He said nothing, but stood up and took his bowl to the sink. Great, Marcus has no pants on. Just dirty, and I mean crazy dirty, tidy whities with several holes around the waistband. I shoot Dan the same grossed out look that he shot me earlier. He jokingly shoots me back a judgmental look and swats my arm. I give him a "No, seriously, I'm creeped out" look, and he nods to acknowledge it. "So, what cabinets are you?" Dan tried to ask, but was interrupted with Marcus pointing to the flowers and asking the old lady,
"Where those from?"
She points to Dan, and Marcus snatches the flowers out of her hand, throws them in an open trash bag sitting on the floor, and walks out of the kitchen into the living room we just walked through. He just lost his dad, so I assumed he had some sort of mental disability and was being sensitive about another dude showing his mum attention. So where are the cabinets and countertop that you need installed?" Dan asked the old woman. "Oh, I thought you were bringing them," she huffed out, sounding shocked that he would even ask that. "Ah, I'm sorry. I thought you said your husband bought them and you needed them installed," Dan said, confused and a bit nervous at how the woman is reacting. "So you brought nothing? What is it you do? What is it you're going to try and sell me?" She gets closer to Dan as she's throwing her hands up in disbelief and anger. Marcus comes quickly, stomping in at the sound of his mother's distress. Rushing in from the other door past the kitchen was another man, around the same age. Wonderful, this guy is in his underwear too. Fucking dirty tidy whities. This woman told Dan on the phone that she lived all alone. This new guy freezes just past the doorway and just stares at me, standing feet away. Marcus rushes forward and stands between us and his mother and pushes her out towards the living room. Both doors are blocked by the fucking tidy whitey twins. Dan scoots me behind him in an attempt to block me from both guys. "We gotta be heading out now," he said calmly. hoping not to escalate things. We hear the old lady squawk out loud, "Ha!" from the living room. Marcus doesn't move. "I'll see what I can do about the cabinets," Dan said as we inched forward. Marcus barely inches forward, but still blocks the way. I frantically tug on Dan's arm to get him to look over at the other guy, now with his hand down his dirty underrag, masturbating. And that's when my calm, chill boyfriend loses it. I've never heard him scream like this. He remembers growing up and his older brother taught him how to deal with bullies. Say some crazy, messed up shit to them and they'll be too stunned to react. Dan screams with rage. "The last person to corner me got beat to fucking death. I'll fucking kill you, your fucking mum, if you don't get the fuck out of my way. My boys are gonna come gang rape your fucking skulls if you don't back the fuck off." Veins popping, spit flying. Marcus looked surprised and he rushed past us towards his brother. For a split second, we both thought he was going to attack Dan, so he instinctively threw up his fist to defend himself. Marcus pushes his brother into the other room and slams the door behind him. Dan and I hurry out of the house. I think the old lady was sitting in the dark in the living room, but I didn't stop to look around as we were scurrying out. We called the cops when we got home. Didn't have cell phones then. But nothing really came of it because they said they didn't really do anything wrong. He didn't expose himself. They didn't try to attack us. They agreed it was bizarre, but nothing that they could do about it. We asked around and no one knew these people, so we're not really sure how she got our number. I don't know if they were just mentally ill, if she lied on purpose to get us over there, or why things happened the way they did. It was just scary as shit, feeling boxed in and not knowing what these creepy, almost naked dudes were thinking. Ever since then, I tend to avoid going inside other people's houses, unless I really know them.
Number 1.
My friend suggested that I tell my creepy story here. I'm a 23-year-old female, and this story happened last summer when I was still in college and living in an apartment. I had 2 other roommates who lived with me. My one roommate, Allie, was originally from a city about 45 minutes from our school, so she went home a lot on weekends. My other roommate, Kate, and I were both from out of state, so we never really went home. So summer rolls around and Allie accepted an internship in her hometown and left for the summer. So it was just me and Kate. We both had internships in town and worked 40 hours a week, so we didn't really see each other except on weekends. My apartment complex was large and had an open layout, so everyone's front doors were accessible from outside. You didn't have to be buzzed in or anything. We lived on the first floor. We also had a lot of friends who lived in our same complex. We would often leave our doors unlocked during the day when we were home in case anyone popped in to say hi. It was a Friday, which meant I didn't have to go into work until noon. All the executives had meetings in the morning, and since I was an intern, I wasn't required to be there. Kate, however, still left at her usual time of 8:30, leaving the door unlocked. Nothing uncommon about that. She knew I would be up soon, plus it was 8:30 AM. What could happen? I was getting ready for work in my bathroom with the door closed around 10 AM when I heard our front door swing open. I figured it must have been one of my friends wanting to borrow something, or Kate had left her lunch here. I waited a minute for my friend to yell my name or raid my fridge, but I didn't hear anything. I suddenly got a very uneasy feeling. I stuck my head out and didn't see anything initially. When I stepped out and turned towards the kitchen, standing in my kitchen was a middle-aged man with his back to me. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I yelled. The man turned around, looking very surprised to see me. He was holding a grocery bag with something in it. I couldn't see what it was. He stared at me for about 5 seconds before telling me he was the maintenance man, and we had called about an issue with our sink. I immediately felt like an idiot for being so rude and thought Kate had put in a request and not told me. She had done this before. He then mumbled something along the lines of he didn't have the proper tools to fix the problem, so he would have to come back later. He then breezed past me and went out the door. Weird. I immediately texted Kate and bitched at her for not telling me that he was coming. She didn't respond, so I continued getting ready for work and left. Around 2 PM, Kate called me on her break to explain that she never put in a maintenance request. I immediately got a very nervous feeling. She told me to call our manager's office and report it. I told my manager the story and he was not exactly very concerned and just blew me off. My apartment complex was pretty safe. The only time I ever saw a police car was to bust some idiots throwing beer bottles off their balcony. The rest of the day, I continued to rationalize to myself that the guy had been maintenance and he was just confused. By the weekend, I had basically forgotten about it. Kate left Friday night for the weekend, meaning I had the apartment to myself, which never happens, so I was pumped. This was around the time of the NBA playoffs, and our hometown team was playing Saturday night, so me and a few of my friends went to a bar to watch the game. My friends were taking an Uber, but were headed in a different direction than me, so I opted to walk. Taking the long way meant I was coming from the opposite direction of where I usually walked in from the parking lot. I could see my windows first from the street, then have to walk around and up a few steps to get to my front door. As I got closer to my apartment, I could tell that something was off with the windows. I could see Ali's window was just barely cracked open. First of all, Ali has been gone since May, and it was the end of June. Then, as I got even closer, I saw that the screen looked funny. It was sideways, like it had been popped out and then it had been put back in, upside down. Now listen, I'm not one to overreact, but I knew for a fact that that window had been closed before I left for the bar. So, I noped the fuck out of there and ran to my friend's apartment on the 3rd floor, where I called the police. I went down when they got there and reiterated the situation to them. They told me to go back to my friend's apartment and wait until they told me it was okay to come out. After about 2 minutes, the cops walked out with, you guessed it, the fucking weirdo who was in my kitchen the day before. The cop was holding this big-ass hunting knife in his hand. I really wish the police hadn't told me what I'm about to tell you, because it still haunts me. They found the creep hiding behind my couch in my living room, holding a hunting knife wrapped in a Kroger bag. And even creepier, had I not walked home and noticed the messed up window, I would have just walked in the front door from the parking lot unknowingly. I had a lot to drink that night, and I had just planned on going right into my room and passing out. I would have fallen asleep with this guy still in my apartment. And I know for a fact that he wasn't just planning on hanging out. Back in the 1980s, my dad and a buddy decided to travel the world. They went to a number of places, including Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand. It was in Australia where my dad and his friend were approached by a man. He was tall, about the same height as my dad, with black hair and a moustache. Now, note that it was obvious that they were tourists. They had their backpacks on and a Canadian flag patch on each. A man approached the two of them and struck up a conversation. My dad says instantly he got a bad vibe from the guy, but for the sake of being polite,
Attention to all Lazarus personnel. There will be an open forum to resolve any questions or concerns. Demonic presence of unsafe mode. Lockdown in effect.
Maximum multiplier. Metal overload. Maximum multiplier. Maximum multiplier.
Demonic presence eliminated. Lockdown disengaged. Volunteers are currently needed for UAC's exciting new Revenant research program. Expand your potential, experience something new, and go beyond.
Olivia activated the Hell Wave from somewhere inside this facility. I did hope she could rise above their influence. I was wrong. She proved to be weaker than I thought she'd be.
Narrator, narrates all. Narrator, off.